Welcome to this webinar, Accelerate Development with WisejNET Hybrid. That's the last webinar of the, I think, 5 ones we organized this week, starting on Friday last week. And yeah, regards development with WisejNET, different webinars where we talked about web enabling of WinForm applications, VB6 and Gupta applications. And today we get a presentation from Levie Rufenacht from ICT Group. And he will show us more about the latest version of WisejNET 3.5 Hybrid. Very interesting. I'm very curious to hear what we can expect from this version. Before I hand this over to you, Levi, just for the organization of this webinar, unfortunately, there is no audio and video for you. So if you have questions, please use the chat function of the tool. I try to give you answers during the webinar or latest afterwards. And with that, Levi, that's your stage. Please tell us more about WisejNET Hybrid.
Okay, thank you, Gunther, for the introduction. So yeah, I'm Levie Rufenacht. I work in Washington, D.C. for ICT Group, and I mainly specialize in the development of the WisejNet framework itself, and now WisejNet Hybrid as well. So let's get started with this presentation here. If I can pull up PowerPoint. Okay, so a quick agenda. I know some of you already know what WisejNet is, but I'm going to tell that again in case there's anybody out there that doesn't know. And then we'll talk briefly about traditional app development and how that's done. And that'll kind of build up and lead us into talking about what is WisejNet Hybrid. And then we'll go over a small demo of building a hybrid application. And then we'll briefly talk about the deployment of a hybrid application. So what is WisejNet? Sorry for the people who have heard this once, twice, or 3 times already, but I'll try to keep it concise. So WisejNet is a web framework for ASP.NET Core that allows you to build enterprise-scale line of business applications. Everything is done in Visual Studio using the WisejNet Designer, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but is right here. And this is installed as a Visual Studio extension available on the Visual Studio Marketplace. And so using this WisejNet Visual Designer, I can drag and drop controls from the Visual Studio toolbox on the left-hand side here onto my designer. So we have simple controls like buttons and text boxes, combo box, to more complex controls like a data grid view, a property grid, or a data repeater. So when I'm dragging and dropping a control like a button or a text box onto the WisejNet Designer, that control is rendered as a HTML element on the HTML control on the designer. So in the case of a text box, that's an HTML input element. In the case of a button, it's an HTML button element. And all of the events on that HTML input element have already been wired to the server. So I have a JavaScript, thinking about a text box. I have a key down event in the browser. I have a key up event in the browser. That event is wired to the server using WebSocket and JSON. So whenever that event fires on the client in my browser, it's synchronized with the corresponding server-side C# or VB object, allowing me to keep both the client and the server synchronized at all times. But the magic of this is that you don't need to know HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So everything that you do as a developer is going to be done in C# or VB. The benefit of this synchronized state is that it also allows the browser to handle a browser refresh, or the application to handle a browser refresh. So when I refresh the browser, the server has a copy of the latest state from the client, which it then reapplies when the browser gets refreshed. In terms of debugging, everything is done using Visual Studio and C#, and I can also use hot reload to make changes to my application in real time. So WisejNet is a very extensible framework as well. So we have 100 plus controls available out of the box. And then we also provide open source extensions on NuGet. And we have premium extensions as well from vendors like DevExpress, Syncfusion, Telerik, Infragistics that you can use in your application as Visual Studio toolbox controls. So I'm going to show you our showcase application briefly. So this is where we showcase all the different controls that are available in WisejNet. So our simple ones like our text box, a combo box, tree view, and kind of the different variants of each control. And so these are the simple ones, and then we have some more complex ones like a property grid, a data grid view, a list view, and a data repeater. So these ones are all available without adding any kind of NuGet extension or additional project. They're available out of the box with WisejNet. And then we have our extensions here. So we have integrations for Ace Editor, Chart.js, Full Calendar, Google Maps, all of the major core business components that you would need in your application. And then here's our premium extension set. So we have Telerik Kendo, DevExtreme, Syncfusion, EJ1, EJ2. These are all the JavaScript component libraries from these vendors that have been wrapped inside of WisejNet as C# controls. So taking a look at this Kendo one, for example, I can see the full Kendo control suite here. And if I pick a control like Kendo Chat, and then I select one of these options. So I have my JavaScript widget here. And if you've ever worked with these JavaScript widgets before, you know that they have a set of events that fire in JavaScript when you type a message, when you click a button, things like that. So all of those events are wired into WisejNet already as C# objects, or C# events. So you don't have to touch any of that. You simply drag and drop the control and configure it in Visual Studio. So that is the premium extension. And the last thing on the demo browser that we have are icon packs. So we have a number of ready-to-use icon packs that you can use inside of your projects. So Bootstrap icons, Visual Studio icons, Vaadin icons, anything that you need in terms of business use cases, you'll probably find here. Okay, going back to this presentation a bit. So this is what you're getting with WisejNet. So you're getting the WisejNet Designer, which is that Visual Studio plugin available on the Visual Studio Marketplace. You're getting all the controls and extensions that we talked about, the simple ones like the text boxes, the data grid views, and then the open source extensions on GitHub. You're getting the WisejNet Theme Builder, and that's what you see on the right-hand side here. So with this Theme Builder, I'm able to build and customize and export themes for my application. So the one you see here in the screenshot is Material. But I guess I'll also show that briefly here, just so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so this is our WisejNet Theme Builder, and this is our preview window. So by default, we're previewing Bootstrap 4 theme, but with WisejNet 3.5, we added a Bootstrap Dark variant. So now I can use Bootstrap Dark to style my application. The power of the theme builder is that if I wanted to tweak this theme and say, instead, I want every single new button that I add to my application to be red instead of this default blue, I could do that here. So I would change the background color of this button to something like red. And now every single new button I drag and drop from that Visual Studio toolbox onto the designer will be red. So it's a very powerful tool. But that is the theme builder. And some of the other things you get with WisejNet. So we have tools for, or integration tools for testing. So Microsoft Playwright, we have built integrations for that. We have samples for unit testing, that kind of thing. So a large testing suite. We have options for deploying to Azure, AWS, if you need to deploy on-premise, or if you need to deploy as a desktop application locally, or now with WisejNET Hybrid, iOS and Android as well. So let's talk about traditional app development briefly. So when you're building applications, you probably think about, an iOS app or a macOS app or a desktop app, something like that. So for iOS, the traditional development method is to use Xcode. Xcode is a Mac-only IDE where all the development is done using Swift or Objective-C. And when you're building a user interface for your iOS or macOS or iPadOS application, you can choose either a storyboard, which is what you see on the right-hand side here, which allows you to drag and drop controls onto a view controller and then wire them to each other. Or you can use Swift UI, which is a declarative syntax for creating user interfaces. So Xcode is great. It's a very powerful tool, but there's a few things to consider with it. First being, are we just building an iOS application, or do we need to build an Android application as well? Do we know Swift, or do we know Objective-C? And do we have the developers with the expertise that can actually execute this application? Is there business logic that we need to embed within this application? Is it already available in another language like C# or VB? These are all things to consider with Xcode, right? And we kind of have a similar situation with Android. So Android development is typically done using Android Studio, which is an IDE for Windows and also Mac. But development of Android applications is typically done using Java or Kotlin. When you're building a user interface using Android and Android Studio, you use an XML-based designer, which allows you to define a layout and the different controls that will appear within that layout. And so very similar to Xcode in terms of considerations, do we know Java? Do we work with Java? Do we know Kotlin? Are we just building an application for Android or also for iOS and desktop as well? So now there's .NET Maui. So .NET Maui is the Xamarin, and also now a platform for building applications for desktop as well for Windows and Mac. The thing with Maui, so it also follows this XML or XAML-based user interface creation. So I define a layout in Visual Studio in the XAML file, and then I define the basic controls that I want to use. So Maui comes out of the box with several controls, but not a large suite of controls. So if you're going to need something more advanced or complex, like a grid, or a complex grid, or a chat controller, anything like that, then you're going to have to use a third-party component vendor. So whether that's a Syncfusion or Telerik or DevExpress, or if you find some kind of open source projects, I think there's a couple on GitHub. but you kind of get those as is. There's no enterprise level support with those projects. So yeah, this is Maui. It's great if you're building simple cross-platform applications and you love working with XAML. The benefit of using Maui is that it also allows you to reuse your C# or VB business logic that you might use for other web projects. So that's a step forward. So kind of putting all of these considerations together, there's a lot to think about. So do we need an interactive designer? Do we like the storyboard approach where we can drag and drop controls from a toolbox onto a designer? Do we need a common theme or style sheet for the application? So if I'm building an Android app and I'm building an iOS app, do I need to have the same theme for both? Or do I just go with a native theme? What kind of controls are we going to be needing in this application? Can we get away with simple labels, text boxes, images, and that kind of thing? Or do we need something more complex to visualize our data or to get user input? Do we have the required hardware to run the IDE to actually build the application? So do you have a Mac for building iOS applications? Developer experience, so that your developers know how to do it. Multi-platform support. So are we targeting desktop and mobile? So Windows, Mac OS, Android, iOS, or just the mobile platforms? And then obviously the development language preference as well. So a lot to think about with that. But now there's a new option, WisejNET Hybrid. So WisejNET Hybrid is a solution for developers looking to build Windows, Mac OS, and mobile applications. And the key feature of WisejNET Hybrid compared to the other platforms is it's kind of taking the best features of each platform. So you're targeting all the platforms, so Windows desktop, Mac desktop, Android, iOS, and you're also getting a visual designer, similar to Xcode Storyboard, but it's the same designer that you use for your regular WisejNet applications. So I can drag and drop buttons, text boxes. I could even use a data grid view in my application, and it all works the same. So in the screenshot here, I have my WisejNet designer, and then I have my code behind file where I define the logic that executes when certain events occur. And then on the right-hand side, I have an iOS simulator showing that exactly what was defined in my visual designer is now running as an iOS application on my device. With WisejNET Hybrid, you also have a shared code base. So since you're using the same WisejNET designer, you can run this application as a web application. You can run it as a mobile application or a desktop application. WisejNET Hybrid is specifically targeted for users that are looking to build line of business applications. If you're just building very simple applications, there might be another platform option for you. But if your goal is enterprise, this is the way to go. So thinking about the architecture a bit, I didn't know this was animated, so it's kind of fun. The architecture of a WisejNET application in of itself. So I access that application using Chrome here, or Safari, or Edge, and then I enter an endpoint, which takes me to a standard ASP.NET Core WisejNet application. And once that connection is established, then I load the page initially. WisejNet establishes a WebSocket connection, which then starts sending changes between the two to synchronize the client-side state and the server-side state. So it's a little bit different with WisejNET Hybrid, but still kind of following that same high-level view. Instead of accessing the application through Chrome or Edge or Safari, you're accessing it through the Hybrid client, which is here. And the Hybrid client is contains a web view, which is how you load that WisejNET application. And it's packaged as an exe file on Windows, an APK or AAB, Android application bundle on Android, or an IPA file on iOS. And once you have that, once your executable starts up, it loads this web view where you define the startup URL. That startup URL could be anything. But when you're configuring the WisejNet application, you're going to put your WisejNet endpoint in there. So this doesn't sound too crazy yet. So, but we have to think about some of the features or what kind of how it all ties in. So hybrid comes in two flavors. So it comes in an online mode, which is kind of like your standard WisejNet application that we've seen. So I'm connecting to a remote web server on Azure or AWS or on-premise. It doesn't matter where it's located. But the important thing to keep in mind with this mode is that I have to have a connection to that remote web server, no matter where it's running. If I lose that connection, I won't be able to use my app. And then we have WisejNet Hybrid Offline, which allows us to embed everything on the device. So now, instead of connecting to a remote web server, we have a local web server. And this is built using Embed.io, which is an open source cross-platform web server for .NET. And so using that, we're able to use WisejNet offline without any connection to any remote web server. We can also have our business logic on the device, or data access, and an embedded database as well. If you need to fetch remote data, you can use HTTP client to make API requests to the server to fetch the data. But in general, the device does not require an internet connection to function. Okay. So we've talked about the architecture of a hybrid application a bit, but we haven't said much about what you can actually do with hybrid. So why would I pick hybrid over just a regular WisejNet app? One of the reasons, reading device information. So I can tell a lot of things about the device when I connect to the hybrid client. One of these things is the network access. So if I'm running offline, I can determine if the device has an internet connection and what profiles it's using to connect to the internet. And a profile could be cellular or Wi-Fi or whatever the device supports. I can determine the orientation of the device, the name of the device. I can get a list of folders on that device. So what is the device's default documents directory? What is the device's default cache directory? Those kinds of things. I can get information about the battery state. So is the user currently running in energy saver mode? How much battery is left? That kind of thing. And this is all done. Go back a slide. This is all done using this device.info singleton. So I do device info, and then I'll see a list of options using IntelliSense of information that I can see about the device. So I can also interact with the device. So if I wanted to, for example, change the color of the status bar, I can do that with one line of C# code here. Device.statusbar.backcolor equals color red or color blue. This can be changed dynamically anywhere in your application, anywhere in your code. I can interact with the device's preference. So preferences are key value pairs that are stored on each device. So each platform has a different implementation of that. But the high level view is I can set store values on the device with a key and value. I can also show things like the device's native tab bar or the device's native toolbar. I can set items, icons, and then I get the event back in C# when a button is clicked. And I forgot to add that to the screenshot. That would have been useful to see. I can also interact with the device's file system. So I can read and write files from the cache directory or anywhere on the device. that you have permissions for. So that's one of the big caveats of traditional web development is how do I interact with that client device's file system? Well, traditionally it's done using a download. So I have some file, I download it and it goes into my downloads directory, and then I have to extract it myself and put it wherever I want. But the benefit of using WisejNET Hybrid is you can read and write files anywhere on the device that's supported. So you can also listen to client or device events. So in this case, I'm listening to see when the connectivity of my device changes. So did my device either disconnect from the internet or did it just gain an internet connection? And then accordingly, I can perform some kind of action to synchronize offline data with a remote data server. Something to keep in mind with these, so this device info member or using the device singleton at all, it doesn't matter if you're running on AWS or Azure or also locally on the device. The interactions that you will make with the device stay the exact same no matter where you deploy this application to. So it makes it very accessible. There's also events for clicking shortcuts. So your application can have a number of shortcuts that allow quick access to certain views or actions within the app. We support push notifications. So I can process when the user sees a notification and then when the user clicks that notification as well. And I can also process events for device orientation. So some of the other integrations we have, you might want to authenticate. So if you're building a login dialog and you want to allow the user to log in with Face ID or Touch ID, you could use something like this. All of this is available with 1 or 2 lines of C# code. Device use device authentication, and then calling a method called authenticate. So what this is doing is it's sending a modal request from your server, and that could be on Azure or AWS or even locally on the device, doesn't matter. And that server is sending a WebSocket message to the client saying the server wants to authenticate the user. And so the client processes that request, and it shows this Face ID or Touch ID dialog, and then it sends the response back over the WebSocket connection to the server. But the server does not continue execution of the code until it receives the result. So by the time I'm on line 21 here, alert box show, I have received the result from the client for this authentication request, even though I'm running on a remote server on the other side of the world, and this application is, wherever it is. So we also have other features like barcode scanning, document scanning, text or optical character recognition scanning, and supports both local and remote push notifications. So this is our barcode scanning example or integration. And so this is based on Android's MLKit framework. And for iOS, it's based on Core ML. So once again, I am showing this modal barcode scanner with 1 or 2 lines of C# code in WisejNet. It allows me to scan multiple barcodes. In this case, I'm scanning, it looks like about 16. I hope it's coming through on the video, all right? But there's a green box around each little barcode here. With this integration, I can also zoom and focus the input. This is our text integration. So in this case, I'm detecting some text on the license plate of this Tesla. And this is the call I'm making. Device use device ML, scan text, and then I pass in a configuration object. So a high-level architecture of how that works. You write this text or this code in your application. This application then sends a request to WisejNet saying the user wants to scan text using this configuration. And then WisejNet sends the request to the hybrid client which is .NET Maui, customized .NET Maui specifically for WisejNET Hybrid, which then sends a request to Mono, which is what allows you to run on all these different platforms in Visual Studio and C#. And then Mono will run this this text scanning integration either on Core ML for iOS or MLKit for Android. And then once it receives the response, it sends it back up, right? So then I get the response from the client to the server, and then to my application where I get an array of strings that were detected inside of the application. So it took a lot of work to build these integrations into WisejNet and create that level of abstraction that allows you to scan text very quickly, scan barcodes, scan Face ID, Touch ID. But there's a lot of things going on under the hood. So, all right, now we're actually going to start building a hybrid application so we can tie all these concepts in. So I'm going to open Visual Studio here. And with WisejNet 3.5, there are 3 new templates. So there is a hybrid client application template, a hybrid offline application template, and a hybrid web page or online template. So we're going to start with a hybrid client application template. Okay, so now I have my solution with the one project, which is the hybrid client. So this hybrid client project represents the hybrid client in this architecture diagram here. So when I build this project, I'm building an executable for iOS or for Android or for Windows. So let's take a look at it quick. Inside of this platforms folder, I have different configurations for Android, iOS, Mac, and Windows. Inside of this Android one, I'll see my Android manifest file, which you're probably used to if you've ever built a mobile application before. But this allows you to define the permissions that your application will use. And then I have an entry point that is specific for this platform. When I edit one of these files inside of this platforms folder, the only target is Android. So each folder, this Android folder, is conditionally compiled for the Android executable. And the same goes for iOS and Windows. I also have a resources folder. So this resources folder is shared for all platforms. So inside of my app icon, I have a simple SVG, which I can use to show as my app's icon. And the same goes for the splash here. I also have a styles folder that has some startup styling configurations, but it's not super important for right now. The other important file with this project is the startup class. So if I take a look at this, and if you guys have ever built a Maui project before, this might look a little familiar. I'm actually using the Maui App Create Builder here, and use Maui App Middleware here. But the part that's different is that it includes this section, Use WisejNET Hybrid. So this is what separates Maui applications from WisejNET Hybrid applications. This configures the startup URL that we talked about. And this would be the address of your WisejNET application. So if I'm building an offline application, it's going to start a local embedded web server, which is going to run on localhost. So this would be the URL I would use for that. I could also put a Azure endpoint in here or an AWS endpoint. But the next thing we're going to do with this is add an offline project. So I'm going to do add new project and select hybrid offline application. Okay. So this project is where I'm going to define my views. my WisejNet UI, and where I'll interact with the WisejNet designer. So if you've ever created a WisejNet project before, you'll see this looks pretty similar to a regular WisejNet template. So I have my page in here, which is a blank slate that I can use to add controls or containers or layouts to. But in this case, I'm going to just add a button to the page. And I'm going to add a very descriptive message to this button that says, click me. And then I'm going to double click the button to add that C# event handler. And this is where I can start interacting with the device singleton. So the first thing that we'll do is just show a regular native pop-up on the device to show that we're connected. So I'm going to do device.popups.displayAlert. And we put in a title, and we put in some message, and that's it. Okay, so now I've defined my UI, I've defined my native interaction, and the thing I need to do next is associate this WisejNet Hybrid offline application with my executable. How do I start up that web server when I run the executable? So we go back to this hybrid client startup file, and there's a line here, use WisejNet offline. So I'm going to uncomment that, and I see that it takes in a type, offline startup. So I need to do one more thing here, which is add a project reference. So inside of my client project, my executable, I want to reference my WisejNet project with my UI and those kinds of things. And then when I right-click offline startup, I see using hybrid offline application. So I import the namespace, and now I have this use WisejNet offline, which will start the embedded web server and link the two projects together. So if we look at offline startup briefly, I can see I'm defining the URL that my web server is going to run on. And I see I'm creating a new web server. So this is the embed.io server. And then I'm injecting WisejNet into that web server. You could also inject your own middleware if you wanted to create some kind of API or something. And then the server runs here. So that's all we need to do to configure this project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run on Windows now. So at the top of my Visual Studio window, if I click this drop down, I can select a device to run on. By default, I want to run on Windows, but I could also run it on Android, iOS, Mac, using either a device that's connected over USB to my Windows machine or a remote simulator. But let's go ahead and run this Windows sample here. And inside of this hybrid app 1 CS project file, this is where I can configure things like the application title. So how do I want this app to be named when it shows up on the user's home screen? And also application identifiers and the application version. All right, so my window just popped up here. Okay. Let's see if this is going to work for us. I had all exceptions enabled, so this thing is going to break. Okay, so now we have our WisejNet view, and we have our little button, click me. So when I click it, I see I get a Windows native alert dialog. So I can also now use hot reload to modify my application. So instead of displaying this alert, maybe we want to show a modal dialog to get some kind of input. So I'm going to do string result equals device pop-ups display prompt. And it's going to say, welcome, enter your name. And then I'll show an alert box with results. So since this is a modal request, if I'm running on Azure or AWS, my server sends the WebSocket request to the client processes the request, and it sends the result back to the server, all before hitting line, it's 18 here, before continuing execution of the program. So I just hot reloaded the application. I'm going to click me, and now I have this Windows native prompt. So I'm going to enter my name, and I get my WisejNet web alert box here. So that's Windows. Now let's run the same application on Android. Set this project as startup so it doesn't keep switching back and forth. This one might take a minute to build. The first time on Android always takes a minute. But when also looking at this project here, so this offline program class, this is your entry point into WisejNet. And it's similar to those that have built WisejNet applications before. Now there's a program CS class, which is the main entry point. So with the hybrid project, it's been refactored, I guess. It's been called offline and then the name of the original class. So offline program or offline startup instead of startup. Instead of default HTML, it's offline HTML. And instead of default JSON, it's offline JSON. Okay, looks like our emulator is connecting here. There we go, there's our startup. So this is the splash screen that we were talking about. So this is just an SVG file that you can configure in your project. And we get our loader. And I get my prompt now. So, but now I have the Android native prompt. So I enter my name again, and I get my alert box. So that looks great. The thing I wanted to show on Android is the events. So I can, well, actually a couple of things. First, I'll also show device info. So I can get information about this client device, such as the device's name. So I'm going to use device.info.system name. And we're just going to show this in an alert box, and I'm going to use hot reload to test it. So I can see this is my device name. And I also have information about the file system. So file system dot, where do I store my local application data? And you'll see the /data user directory that is Android's default directory. So that's device info. We can try hot reload for attaching to this event, but it might not work. If I wanted to attach to network events, I would do device info networking connectivity changed, and then add the handler for it. And then and here var status equals actually, we'll just do alert box show, and then we'll stringify an object that contains all of our networking information, so we can see everything every time it changes. But this isn't going to work because the page doesn't get recreated, so it doesn't attach to this event handler. But what I can do is I can move it in here, maybe. Okay, so now I should be attached to network events. And so I'm going to disable the internet on this Android phone here, Android emulator. And I see I get the event here. So I can see I have no network access and I'm not connected using Wi-Fi or cellular. If I just add one, so in this case, cellular, I can see I get an event immediately in my application. I have internet connection and I'm connected using cellular. And then if I add Wi-Fi as well, I should get another event. Now I have both. So that's kind of the cool things about these events. The next thing I'm going to show is creating an online project. So I'm going to right-click my solution, add new project, and add this hybrid web page application project. So this is following the other architecture, this one, yes, where I have a remote application and then I have my local client. But I need to have that internet connection in between to run the application. So we'll kind of do the same thing with this one. Add a button. Click the button, add a handler, device, pop-ups, display alert. Okay, and the way I can test this is I can use Azure DevTunnels. So that way that works, I'm going to set my online project as the startup application, and inside of the drop-down menu in Visual Studio, I can see an option called DevTunnels here. So what DevTunnels do is they create a temporary app service on Azure that allows you to debug your ASP.NET Core application or ASP.NET application. And then it removes this this app service once you're done in Visual Studio. So it's very temporary. So I'm going to call it test2, very descriptive. And I'm going to define a persistent tunnel. So I will always have the same URL every time I start debugging the application. And I'm going to make access to it public. I click OK. I create the dev tunnel. And sorry, one more thing inside of this page before we test it. I'm going to add a check. So if device valid, then show this alert. Otherwise, show a regular WisejWeb alert box. Because when I'm connected from a browser, I'm not going to be able to use those native device integrations. Not connected to hybrid client. There we go. Okay, so let's run this, and this is actually going to run on Azure. So I don't know if you can see it in the video, but this URL is not localhost. It's a DevTunnels URL. Continue. And I click my button, and I see my alert box not connected to hybrid client down there. So what I would do, I copied that URL that I was using. I would go back to my hybrid client project inside of startup here, and I'm going to paste it here. So now I'm loading this remote application. So what I'm going to do now is start this project. And then I'm going to disable offline for now in our hybrid client. So I open this web browser here, and now I'm starting the hybrid version. And I can do debug, either start new instance or start without debugging. I think the problem if I do this is it's going to launch on Android, but let's see if it works. Debug, start without debugging. Okay, looks like it's working. Fingers crossed. Okay, yeah, so I get my prompt to access the application. I click the button, and I have my native pop-up, even though I'm connected to a remote web server. So that is hybrid, and that is kind of how you would go about building an application with it. The other thing I wanted to show is our showcase application. So we built this app to demonstrate every single kind of feature that you could integrate into your hybrid app. So it shows things like sensor integration. So if you wanted to use the device's accelerometer or compass or gyroscope, any of that, not really business use cases, but still kind of cool features. You can see those here. You can see the authentication integration and this device info. So this shows all of those device info members that are available to you. So you can see whether you're able to compose emails or information about notifications, system information, and the versioning information that I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of cool as well. But yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to show with that. I'm going to go back to the slideshow. And we're a couple slides behind here. Sorry about that. Okay. In terms of deployment, the way you deploy a WisejNet Hybrid application is the same as you would deploy a .NET Maui application. So you can use that Visual Studio publishing tool to generate an archive of your executable, and then you can upload that archive to, on iOS, it's App Store Connect. For Android apps, it would be the Google Play Store. You can deploy a public app, or you can deploy a private enterprise application. It makes no difference. But all of that work is done within Visual Studio and C#. So this is the showcase application that I showed you earlier. So this is running as a desktop application. And then we have our mobile application here. And if you guys would like to try it, we have two demos here. So we have the test flight application, which you can download, and then you can download it from the Google Play Store as well, if you would like to try it. So WisejNet Hybrid in a nutshell. You just need to know one language, C#. Your page is rendered in Visual Studio using the what you see is what you get designer. You have the entirety of the .NET ecosystem available to your application. So packages, the integrations, everything that's available in .NET is available in WisejNet Hybrid. There's multiple modes for different environments. So if you're working out in the middle of the nowhere and you need to access this application, you can build an offline application. We have a full set of integrations and controls for enterprise business use cases. So the simple controls, text boxes, buttons, complex controls, data grid view. And WisejNet is a complete technology stack for web, mobile, and desktop development. So that is all I have for you guys. Thank you for coming. I guess Gunter's information here and my contact information if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Levi. That was a great presentation, very well structured, including the basics of WisejNet. I hope all of you could that and get an idea what WisejNet Hybrid is. I think a few days ago you released the beta version of 3.5, and I'm not sure if there is already a release date planned for that, but I'm sure it takes not too long.
Yeah,
So as said, thank you very much for your interest in this kind of technology, which is a great development and perhaps future for your solution. Either you are still on VB6, Gupta, or already on WinForm or on WisejNet. It hopefully helps you to improve your solution or to write mobile applications much better or desktop applications much better than before. If you have questions, please send us a mail. If you would like to get the presentation as well, then you get it as a PDF version. So thanks a lot to all of you. Thanks to Levi. Greetings to Washington, D.C. And yeah, see you next time when we organize the next webinar. Thanks.
thank you guys.